All right, let's talk about Jamestown, America's first permanent English colony. But we're not going to rehash the story you think you know. Instead, we're going to get into the secret weapon, the one thing that kept the entire project from completely falling apart. So let's just cut right to the chase with the big question, right? What was it that actually saved this colony from becoming just another footnote, another total, absolute failure?
Now, you might immediately think, oh, it was gold or maybe that famous tobacco crop. And yeah, tobacco was hugely important, but it wasn't the answer. Nope. The real game changer, well, it was a business decision. A pretty cold, calculated one at that. To really get this, you have to understand just how bad things were at the start. So let's dive into our first section, a failing outpost. And believe me, this place was on life support, right on the very brink of disappearing entirely. Here's the key thing to remember. Jamestown wasn't set up to be a town, not really. It was basically a military outpost, a temporary camp. It was filled with guys, soldiers, adventurers, who were there for one reason: get rich quick and then get out. Nobody was planning on sticking around. You know, there was just no sense of community, no long-term vision. So get this, the first ships arrive in 1607 with about 100 settlers. How many of them do you think were English women? Just two. Two! A Mistress Forrest and her maid, Anne Burris. That's it, in a sea of men. And it didn't get better quickly. I mean, look at this. Even a full 13 years later, by 1620, the numbers were still completely lopsided. We're talking 90% men. You just can't build a society like that. It's not sustainable. It's fundamentally unstable. There's no foundation, no families. But in the middle of all that chaos and uncertainty, you get this one little glimmer of what could be. Remember Anne Burris, the maid? Well, in 1608, she marries a carpenter named John Leyden, and that right there was the very first English wedding in all of Jamestown. It's just one couple, I know, but it was this tiny, powerful symbol that maybe, just maybe, this place could become a real home. Okay, so back in London, the Virginia Company is watching all this and they are panicking. Their investment is circling the drain. So they come up with this radical plan. And that brings us to Section 2, the company's investment. This was, and I'm not exaggerating, a wild social experiment designed to solve a massive economic crisis. And this plan is where we get the term tobacco wives. So what does that mean? Well, the company started recruiting women to go to Jamestown. But here's the huge catch. The trip wasn't free. A man in the colony, a prospective husband, had to pay for her passage. And he had to pay for it with the only thing of real value they had, tobacco. And we're not talking about a small amount here. The price tag for a wife was 150 pounds of good leaf tobacco. So let's be really clear. This was not a love story. This was a business deal, plain and simple, a direct, calculated investment. The company was also super specific about who they wanted. Their recruitment ads, if you will, called for women who were, and this is a direct quote, young, handsome, and honestly educated. So you see what they're doing, right? They weren't just shipping over people. They were trying to import the very building blocks of a proper English society. So the big question is, did it work? Oh yeah, it worked. Big time. Which brings us right into Section 3, Architects of Permanence, because that's exactly what these women became. Their arrival completely transformed Jamestown from a failing camp into a real, rooted society. I mean, just look at the before and after here. You go from a transient, all-male, unstable outpost that's all about grabbing resources to a rooted, family-based, stable community that's actually focused on, well, building a community. That's not just a change, that is a seismic shift. And the impact wasn't just social. It was immediate and deeply economic. A wife was an economic powerhouse. Think about it. She's managing the garden, the chickens, preserving food, making dairy products, spinning thread, sewing clothes, and on top of all that, she's probably helping process the cash crop. A wife arriving in a household could literally double its productivity overnight. But maybe the most profound thing they did, the most long-lasting contribution, was this. They raised the very first generation of English people who were born in Virginia. Kids who didn't think of England as some distant home. For them, Jamestown was home. A whole new American identity was being born, right there on the Chesapeake.
Okay, but this is where it gets really complex and honestly super interesting. There's this huge paradox at the heart of their lives, which is what Section 4 is all about, power and paradox. How much real influence did they have in a system designed to give them almost none?
To get a handle on this, you have to understand a legal concept called coverture. It's an old English law, and it's pretty wild. Basically, when a woman got married, her legal identity vanished. It was just absorbed by her husband. Think about that. You can't own property in your own name. You can't sign a contract. You can't sue someone. Legally, you barely existed. That was the official reality. But then you look at what was actually happening on the ground. Despite that law, these women were major players. When their husbands died, they often took over and ran huge plantations. They owned and operated businesses like taverns. They controlled property through dower rights. They even went to court. Take Jane Dickinson, who literally filed a petition to fight for her own freedom. And maybe most importantly, they were the ones weaving together the social fabric of the colony's elite through marriage. And it's also really important to put this in context with the world around them. Look at the difference between English women and their Powhatan counterparts. Powhatan women were in charge of agriculture, a super public, central, and powerful role. The English men saw this and thought the Powhatan men were lazy. Meanwhile, the English ideal for their own women was a private, domestic role, managing the household. Two totally different worlds. But in both societies, women's work was absolutely essential. So where does all this leave us? What's the big takeaway here? Well, that's our final section, the Founding Mothers' Legacy. We're going to see how this wild social experiment ended up creating the foundation for the entire American elite. This really sums up the whole journey perfectly. You can see the evolution right here. It starts in 1607, with women just being these incredibly rare survivors. And then you move to the 1620s, and they become this intentional investment, the tobacco wives, brought in to create stability. And then by the mid-1600s and beyond, they're the matriarchs, the plantation managers, the ones building the powerful families that would go on to run the colony.
So if you remember one thing, let it be this. These women weren't just wives. They were a targeted social experiment. They were a critical economic investment. They were quite literally the secret weapon designed to save a failing colony.
And if you think that's an overstatement, think again. This legacy runs deep. You know all those famous names from the American Revolution, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lees. Every single one of those powerful Virginia families owes its existence to these women, their wealth, their land, their power. It all traces back to these founding mothers. So I'll just leave you with this final question to chew on. When the actual survival of a society depends entirely on the presence and labor of women, what does that tell you about where power really lies?